Hello and welcome to Media 7. Before a live audience at the Classic in Auckland, city of perpetual humidity, we'll be examining journalism both in the instant and the long haul. Later in the show, we ask how the newspaper has changed in the 10 years since the New Zealand Herald has been online, and where it goes next. But first, it's the Crusaders. No, not the rugby team, but the journalists who take on unpopular causes and sometimes help free innocent men.
One of the most important functions of journalism is to be a voice for those who have had wrong done against them. It's the stuff of movies.
Oh God, so many lies.
Advocacy or crusading journalism has a proud history in New Zealand.
I think the only way you'll get the public on side is if they understand what's gone on up till now.
Do you believe I'm innocent?
The 1970 case of the Crew murders set the bar. Here, Arthur Allen Thomas was wrongly convicted of killing Jeanette and Harvey Crew. Advocacy by David Yallop and Pat Booth helped to free Arthur Allen Thomas and clear his name.
In our case, it was the best part of 9 years. In all honesty, there probably was not one day in those years when the issue was not on my mind.
More recently, the conviction of David Doherty for child rape was overturned after spirited and dogged work from a team that included journalist Donna Chisholm. It was the subject of this TV1 drama until proven innocent. The number of stories that Chisholm wrote on the campaign shows that it takes a special determination to battle these causes. Currently, 2 high-profile murder convictions are the subject of advocacy journalism. Scott Watson's conviction for the murders of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope is questioned in the work of Keith Hunter. His documentary Murder on the Blade and book Trial by Trickery take up the cause of Watson, who maintains his innocence.
He does not accept his convictions, he maintains his innocence, and he pledges to fight against those convictions for as long as he can.
And a recent North and South cover story questions the safety of the conviction of Mark Lundy. Both these cases involve circumstantial leaps by the Crown and apparently conflicting evidence. And both involve incredible amounts of work by journalists on behalf of people judged guilty of despicable acts.
Mr. Lundy's conviction appeal is dismissed.
Media 7 today asks, what drives journalists in these cases? How do they know what they are doing is right? What does involvement in these messy and emotive cases cost them? And where would the people who have had wrong done against them be without the journalists that take up these fights?
Simon Pound there. We're joined by the Crusaders front row now. Pat Booth, whose advocacy for Arthur Thomas became part of our cultural history. Donna Chisholm, who now can actually answer the question, who would play you in the movie of your life? And Keith Hunter, whose determination that Scott Watson is innocent of the Sounds murders has produced a book, a film and a lively website. Welcome to you all. I wonder if we could start by asking you, each of you in turn, whether there was a single trigger in each of these cases that you took up that got you started on it, whether there was a thing that just didn't add up. Was that the case for you, Pat?
It was. It was a strange trigger, actually. It was a car that pulled out of a car park in front of the Supreme Court about 5 o'clock one night. I was driving past on my way home. I thought I'll pop in and see what happens when the jury comes back. And what the absolute uproar, the genuine cries and the whole attitude of the Thomas family and him convinced me of something which I had been feeling throughout the week. I'd been going up there on occasions to hear the evidence. I felt the evidence didn't add up, and it was just the emotion of that moment. I actually went home and cried. I wept.
So right from that point, you were involved in the case today. You were emotionally involved, which is it's a tricky line, isn't it?
It is. You've got to keep very careful. I'm sure that Donna has had the same experience, that you've got to keep yourself to a degree back from the person involved. You've got to be as dispassionate as it possibly is, but you've got to have passion yourself. You've got to have anger. You've got to have a real desire to overturn what you see as an injustice. You've also got to have a fairly thick skin as well.
Donna, I can see you nodding there.
Well, I started off from a completely different position to Pat. I had the DNA evidence explained to me in the Doherty case by a fantastic scientist called Ari Gerson, who is the real hero, I think, of the Doherty case. He identified from a very small story in the paper about Doherty's appeal being lost, where the appeal court said that the DNA evidence not only pointed towards David, it pointed away from him as well. And Ari knew that in a one-offender rape, that's problematic. So he explained the DNA evidence to me, and it was just a revelation.
So it was crucial having a scientist who took issue with the evidence.
Well, I couldn't have interpreted it. We needed an expert, and he had seen it and had also had prior experience of what he regarded as slightly suspect ESR interpretation.
You had Jim Sprott, didn't you?
I was just about to barge in my inimitable fashion. Yes, Jim Sprott had been a scientific witness at the second trial on the particularly crucial cartridge case. And I actually wrote a book which was in the stage of production, and the publishers got warning that they felt it was defamatory. They pulled the plug, and I then wrote a series of 10 interminable articles for the Auckland Star analysing the evidence. And that was the first time that Jim and I came together. And I produced for him evidence which supported his contentions at that second trial. And from then on, we were like Siamese twins.
What about you, Keith? I mean, it's clearly to you it's all about the evidence and the evidence not stacking up. What actually got you going on it?
Three things, really. First was at the time, I mean, I think I thought it was Watson, as did everyone else in the country, for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then suddenly the police morphed a large 2-masted yacht into a small 1-masted yacht, and I got the shivers then. And then a few months later, we had the story about the hatch scratches. Remember the hatch scratches? This girl who had scratched in terror and panic at these, well, that struck me as being Hollywood B-grade stuff that doesn't actually happen in life. And in fact, when I made the film, I got 3 girls to come down into Blade and put them in there one at a time with a camera, gave them half an hour with a camera, and said, okay, you're being raped, murdered, your mate's been lying dead in the bed, get out of here, or do something. Then they had 20 minutes with the camera. Not one of those people even dreamed of scratching at the hatch cover. I put it to them, how about scratching at the hatch cover? And they all said, why? That doesn't make sense. So that was my second one. The third one was, in fact, about 6 or 7 years ago, when an accountant on Waiheke, Mike Gallagher, brought to me a draft of a book he wanted to get published. And I had a look at that the night he brought it to me, thinking that accountants don't know about these things. And I changed my mind and thought that he didn't know about what he was talking about, so it started then. And I thought, there's a film in this. And it all started from there.
You got involved basically as an independent journalist, rather than, you weren't working around or anything else?
Unfortunately, no.
Would you rather have had the shelter of working for a major news organisation?
It would be really nice financially, but I have to say that I'm one of those unfortunate males who does one thing at a time really well, I think, and 2 things at a time not too well at all.
As you said, everyone in the country thought Watson was guilty. I still have no opinion on whether he was or not, but it strikes me.
You've read my book.
It strikes me
We'll have words with you.
It strikes me as it being quite a step to get in behind someone who was so obviously, as portrayed in the media, a bad guy. Did that have a big impact on the way that case went?
Huge, yeah. I mean, that's what convicted Watson. He was convicted in everyone's eyes throughout the country over a period of 4 or 5 months prior to his trial, prior to his arrest. That's why he's in jail now. Extraordinary job of victimisation by the police through the press, with stories that just did not match the truth that I came to read and to know about by reading the material. See, all I've done really is read the material. It's been available to other people, but it's always been there. And when you read the material and compare it with what went down in the trial and what the police were saying to the press, the difference is extraordinary.
Do you think what appeared in the press had an influence on the jury's decision?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't say that they thought this because of this or this because of this, but I do know that the whole of the country, until recently, they still were biased against Watson, simply because of the false material put out in the press at the time. And since.
Was that an issue with Doherty? Because he did have a criminal record, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And it was there were no crimes of violence, I have to say. But in the media, I think it gets a bit petty and a bit factionalised, and when the Sunday Star Times had the story, other media made it their business to shoot the story down and to shoot him down, and to do that they tried a character assassination. But I think, you know, in situations like this, vulnerable people who have a record, albeit small, okay, he might have had a number of convictions, but they were, you know, non-violent. Those are the sort of people who get into this trouble. You know, if he'd been the next door neighbour of this child who alleged that he'd raped her and had squeaky clean, he was a businessman, the cops might have thought twice or three times.
If he'd been Ned Flanders, it wouldn't have happened.
The same thing goes down with Mark Lundy, who was really treated beautifully by the press, with the fat guy who acted badly at his wife's funeral. I think the same goes, and I don't know, I'm not saying this guy's innocent at all, but Michael Wallace. Do you remember Michael Wallace? It was the guy on the East Coast and connected with the German tourists who went down. If you have a look at the pictures that you'll find on the web of Michael Wallace, and they've all got this evil look to them. They're all halfway through a blink, as they did with Watson. And so it's he looks like an evil man because of the pictures that they've chosen to put on to publicise. And I think that process goes right through all of these things. So when you look at what you're presented with in the press by the police, you can never actually trust it, in my view.
Was that a factor in the work you did on the Thomas case?
Yes, it was. I think that he was also a victim of the process that we have in law, in that when a trial begins, the Crown produces its evidence 3-4 hours. They don't say this may have happened, they say this has happened, this is what he did, this is what he did. He went into the house, he killed these 2 people, he dumped their bodies in the river, he abandoned their daughter. Terrible, terrible. Now, the process, as we well know in the media, is that some days later the defence will begin their defence. The story will probably have slipped back to page 5. If there's been a big firestorm in Victoria, it probably won't hit the paper at all. And so the public are conditioned from the very beginning. Now, the real problem with the Thomas case was the cartridge case, which his supporters had always said was planted, and I believed it had been, and was able to prove, along with Jim Sprott, that it definitely had been planted. And at that stage, the case should have fallen to pieces. But of course, big reputations were at stake, and they continued to lie, to defend their lies, and at that stage you cannot win.
Now let's talk about this word, lies. Would you all say that in these cases, in your opinion, that someone lied about the evidence? Oh,
well, if I can just continue on Thomas, because Thomas was a classic case of fabricated and planted evidence. There was no question of that at all. And the Royal Commission, which followed, laid it right on the line. They said that he had been a victim of this conspiracy. They named the 2 police officers whom they said had carried out the conspiracy. One of them was dead by that time. The other one was never charged. No question at all. Lies, conspiracy, deceit, falsification.
And yet you had, 2 years ago, you had a public battle with a police historian who insisted that the cartridge story was not true.
Oh yes. Well, you know, once you destroy the cartridge case, you've destroyed them, and they take a long while to destroy.
I think my case is the Doherty case is slightly different in that lies is quite a strong word, but I do think that the ESR interpretation of those DNA results at the appeal court and the evidence that a particular scientist continued to give at Doherty's retrial that interpretation was scandalous. And the ESR has never really put its hands up and said and divorced itself from her interpretation of those results.
Because we're used to thinking of scientific evidence given in court as being beyond reproach, aren't we?
That was certainly not beyond reproach. And you know, that scientist is no longer working in New Zealand, and the person at the ESR who divorced himself from her interpretation of that evidence is no longer working there, and they have, to this day, will not say that they did anything wrong. And you know, that says something about the culture of that place, which also goes to, you know, if I may make a point about the current story about the DNA data banks, I think until we get some more scrutiny of how the ESR is operating, might be an unsafe thing to do to extend it.
Maybe we should discuss that topic now. The Sensible Sentencing Trust is saying it's going to fix everything. There's going to be no more David Doherty cases because all this DNA will be on record. The police will have sweeping rights to take it. Is it going to be that fix?
Well, it has the potential to be, but I think until we've got safeguards in place and, as I said, greater scrutiny of the way that the ESR handles its samples and the separation of the samples between the crime scene samples and the reference samples. Here, what they want to do is get a whole huge bank of reference samples, which is of everybody in New Zealand, so that we can then say, oh, here's a crime, let's find it.
And I wonder whether people actually do accept that, because they've been watching CSI on television and every crime gets solved by forensics. The DNA does it all.
Well, I think...
It's not that way in the real world, is it?
Well, in the Doherty case, it's interesting. We had, at the retrial, compelling DNA evidence that there was another person. There was no evidence of David, except that the ESR scientists said that they thought he, in her laboratory experience, he could be there. He wasn't, as it subsequently proved. And then we've got, you know, a 10-hour jury deliberation with this compelling DNA evidence because we had a witness who said it was him. So while you might say that DNA evidence makes it open and shut, in this case it was torture.
I think DNA evidence, it's a danger too. It's very easy to make mistakes with it in the terms it can be planted very easily, it can be shifted very easily, it can tell stories that are not true. And one of the things that gets me about the DNA evidence is the way the scientists concerned give odds on it being no one else. You know, 45,000 zillion million trillion to 1 that no one else has got this DNA. Now, I don't know where they get those figures from. I'd really like somebody to do the maths for me to see what it works. But I get the feeling half the time they just make it up.
Well, we'll talk a little more about evidence and what juries make of it after the break, and we'll be back soon.